What if the night sky wasn't as silent and predictable as we've always believed? For centuries, people have looked up at the stars thinking they were distant, steady, eternal. But every now and then, something unexpected tears across the darkness and refuses to be ignored. A blazing visitor, unpredictable, dramatic, and almost theatrical in its timing. A comet. Most of the time, these icy wanderers are rare enough that an entire generation might only see one in their lifetime. That's what makes what's happening right now so unnerving. In just a single year, we're not talking about one comet or even two, we're talking about seven. 7 sudden intrusions, each appearing like a messenger carrying secrets from the far reaches of the universe, all arriving within months of each other. Scientists call them coincidences. Skeptics dismiss the timing as natural chance. But if you've been paying attention, if you've followed the whispers online, if you've noticed the way these appearances overlap with moments of turmoil on Earth and unusual activity in our own sun, you might start to wonder whether there's more at play here than simple randomness. Because history has taught us one thing: humanity has never seen comets as harmless background phenomena. They've always been omens of change, of disaster, of revelations waiting to unfold. And in 2025, we're not just seeing a comet or two, we're watching a cosmic parade, unlike anything in modern memory. What force could possibly pull them together? Why are they appearing now in the middle of a solar cycle about to hit its peak? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what are they trying to tell us? The story behind this sudden swarm isn't just about science. It's about mystery, timing, and the unsettling possibility that the universe sometimes sends messages we can't afford to ignore. It all started with what seemed like a small announcement, the kind of minor astronomical update that usually slips by without much notice, buried in the flood of space news that only hardcore enthusiasts ever follow. A new comet, spotted faintly in the sky, given a clinical name and catalogue number. At first, nobody outside the astronomy community really cared. After all, comets pass through our skies every so often, most so faint that the average person would never even notice unless someone pointed it out. But then, just a few weeks later, another discovery was reported, and then another. Suddenly the list was growing, and the coincidences began to stack in ways that no one could ignore. By the time people realized what was happening, the number wasn't 1, or 2, or 3, but 7 separate comets, all appearing within the same year, a number that seemed to defy the ordinary rhythms of the cosmos. To understand why this was so shocking, you need to know what makes comets so special in the first place. Unlike planets that move with a predictable steadiness or stars that seem fixed against the black, comets are drifters, icy bodies from the furthest edges of the solar system or even beyond, frozen relics from the dawn of creation. Most of them spend billions of years wandering in silence, tucked away in the vastness of the Oort cloud or drifting near the Kuiper belt, until some gravitational nudge or unseen cosmic accident kicks them into a path that carries them toward the inner solar system. When that happens, and when the comet happens to come close enough to Earth, we're treated to a display that has mesmerized humanity for as long as we've looked up at the sky. A glowing head, a tail stretched across the heavens, and a sense of mystery that no telescope can fully explain. But here's the thing: naked eye comets, the kind that even an ordinary person can step outside and see, are extremely rare. Some years pass with none at all. Other times, if we're lucky, we might get one bright enough to capture public imagination. The most famous, Halley's Comet, only swings by once every 76 years. That's how slow the universe usually plays its hand. So when the tally started to climb, 1, 2, 3, 4, and finally 7, astronomers themselves started to whisper that something unusual was unfolding, something they couldn't easily chalk up to routine. 7 visible comets in 1 year doesn't just stretch the odds, it smashes them. Think about it this way: if you live in a small town, you might see a celebrity pass through once in a decade. Maybe by coincidence, 2 show up around the same time. But imagine if 7 A-list stars rolled through your main street in 1 year, all unannounced, all on different paths, but arriving in such close timing that it feels like a coordinated event. You'd wonder if it was a festival, a publicity stunt, or maybe even something stranger. That's exactly how the astronomical community reacted when the comet count for 2020. Each of these comets had its own personality, its own orbital path, and its own faint clues about where it came from. Some originated deep in the solar system, nudged by the slow tug of Jupiter's immense gravity. Others seemed to come out of nowhere, faint smudges in distant telescopes that suddenly brightened as they drew closer to the warmth of the sun. And yet, even though they were technically unrelated, their timing made them feel like a group, like a chorus of voices arriving together to deliver a message. Scientists catalogued them clinically, giving them sterile designations like pan-stars, swan, atlas, lemon, neat, and the mysterious interstellar object that came to be called Three-Eye Atlas. But ordinary people didn't care about catalogue numbers. To them it felt eerie, as though the sky had chosen this moment to remind humanity that we are small, fragile, and never in control of the forces that rule the universe. When the second and third comets appeared, most astronomers brushed it off. Statistical noise, they said, just a cluster of coincidences. But by the fourth and fifth, that explanation started to ring hollow. It's not that the universe couldn't deliver multiple comets in one year, of course it could. But the rarity of naked eye visibility made this different. These weren't faint, forgettable dots seen only through expensive telescopes. These were visible streaks of ice and light that demanded attention, even from those who never cared about space before. Suddenly, every social media feed seemed to carry a blurry photo of a glowing tail against the night sky. People in cities looked up through light-polluted skies and caught glimpses. Villagers in remote parts of the world stared at brilliant displays stretching across the horizon. What had begun as minor scientific notes was now a global spectacle, and the more people noticed, the more unsettling it became. Because comets have never been just scientific curiosities. Throughout history, they've been harbingers, omens, warnings from the heavens. Ancient dynasties recorded their arrivals as signs of divine displeasure. Wars and famines were said to follow in their wake. Even in modern times, the sudden appearance of a bright comet stirs something primal in human imagination, as though our DNA still carries the memory of ancestors who feared what such visitors meant. And here, in the span of a single year, we weren't dealing with just one omen, we were dealing with seven. 7 intrusions stacked like drumbeats, each one amplifying the sense that something extraordinary was unfolding, whether we understood it or not. At observatories around the world, astronomers began quietly comparing notes. Yes, the comets were on independent orbits. Yes, their paths could be explained by gravitational mathematics. But still, the timing nagged at them. Why now? Why so many? Why, during a solar cycle already ramping toward its peak, when the sun itself seemed unusually active? It was easy to dismiss the whispers as superstition, yet difficult to ignore the nagging coincidence. Even the most skeptical scientists had to admit, nature sometimes clusters events in ways that feel anything but random. Outside of the scientific community, the speculation took on a life of its own. Online forums buzzed with theories. Some claimed the comets were fragments of a larger body that had shattered long ago, finally making their way into the inner solar system in waves. Others pointed to the interstellar visitor, Three-Eye Atlas, and wondered whether its presence somehow triggered or coincided with the swarm. Conspiracy theorists went further, suggesting hidden forces, secret knowledge, or even extraterrestrial origins. Was it possible, they asked, that humanity was being sent a warning, that these cosmic visitors were not just icy leftovers of creation, but messages written across the night sky? Even the media, usually cautious about hyping astronomy stories, leaned into the drama. Headlines described a parade of comets, a cosmic flood, an unprecedented celestial alignment. The truth was more complicated, of course. But for once, public excitement about space was at a fever pitch. Children were dragged outside by their parents to see the glowing streaks. Amateur astronomers set up telescopes in city parks and invited strangers to look, and each new appearance seemed to feed the sense of momentum, as though the universe was building towards some climax. By the time the 7th comet was announced, even those who mocked superstition had to admit that it felt unusual, not just rare, but uncanny. The sky was busy in a way it hadn't been in living memory, and the weight of that fact pressed on anyone who cared enough to look up. Whether you were a scientist, a believer in omens, or just someone scrolling through social media at night, the question crept in eventually. What did it mean? Was this simply the chaotic beauty of the universe playing out in front of us? Or was there a deeper story, one that science hadn't yet deciphered? And perhaps that's the true power of this sudden swarm, not the light show itself, dazzling though it was, but the unease it stirred. Comets have always forced humanity to confront the unknown, to wrestle with the possibility that the universe is not a static backdrop, but an active stage, with events and actors we barely understand. And in 2025, the appearance of 7 comets in a single year didn't just challenge statistics. It awakened that old primal fear, the sense that the sky itself was trying to tell us something, and that we might not want to hear the answer. When people first began noticing that the sky seemed unusually crowded, it was easy to shrug it off as a fluke. After all, the universe is full of randomness, full of unlikely events that just happen to line up now and then. But the deeper anyone looked at the timing of these arrivals, the harder it became to write them off as mere coincidence. Because it wasn't just that 7 comets had appeared within a single year, it was the way they appeared in such close succession, as though scheduled on a cosmic calendar that no one had ever been invited to see. If you charted their discoveries on a timeline, you didn't see the usual scattered pattern of chance encounters. You saw a cascade, a steady drumbeat that refused to be ignored. That timing was what first began to gnaw at astronomers. Each comet had its own orbit, its own origin story, yet the clustering made them look like pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, might reveal a much larger picture. And then, as if the heavens weren't already making the point obvious, an outsider appeared, something so strange and so unexpected that it forced everyone to look twice. This was no ordinary comet, no leftover from our own solar system's formation. This was an interstellar visitor, an object that had spent millions, perhaps billions of years drifting through the void between stars, only to arrive in our neighborhood right as the comet swarm was reaching its peak. Its official designation was 3I Atlas, a sterile string of letters and numbers meant to slot it neatly into human filing systems. But nothing about this visitor was neat, and nothing about its timing could be comfortably explained. To appreciate why its arrival set off alarms in both scientific and public imagination, you have to remember just how rare interstellar visitors are. For centuries, astronomers had watched the skies, cataloguing comets, asteroids, and meteor showers, and every single one of them seemed to be part of the same family: bodies, born of our solar system, circling our sun in orbits long and short. It wasn't until 2017 that we got our first undeniable outsider, the infamous UMO, a long, cigar-shaped object that flew through the inner solar sheriff on a hyperbolic trajectory, moving so fast that the sun could never capture it. That one sighting shook the astronomical community to its core. And now, just a few short years later, here came another, 3I Atlas, as though the universe had decided to remind us that interstellar wanderers were not once-in-a-lifetime oddities, but perhaps regular messengers, only just now visible to us thanks to improved telescopes and global vigilance. Still, even with that context, the coincidence was staggering. What were the chances that in the exact same year Earth was already seeing a record-breaking surge of comets, a stranger from another star system would also drift into view? To a scientist, the timing was frustrating, because it begged questions they couldn't answer without risking their reputations. To a storyteller, it was almost too perfect, the kind of eerie overlap that makes you wonder if the universe has a sense of irony. And to ordinary people, who didn't care about orbital mechanics or gravitational perturbations, it simply felt like a message. One after another, the heavens were lighting up, not faintly, not invisibly, but brilliantly enough for millions to notice. If there was ever a time for speculation, this was it. What made 3I Atlas even more unsettling was its behavior. Unlike typical comets that only flare when they near the warmth of the sun, this one showed strange activity even while still distant, out where temperatures should have kept it frozen solid and quiet. It released material, it brightened, it acted alive in ways that didn't line up with what textbooks said comets should do. Some scientists cautiously suggested unusual chemistry or an unfamiliar composition. Others whispered more dramatic possibilities, but only in private, unwilling to be mocked by their peers. To the public, however, the narrative wrote itself. An alien visitor had arrived, right in the middle of a comet parade, glowing and shedding mass in ways that seemed like signals, like flares, like fireworks deliberately designed to be noticed. As the swarm unfolded, the overlap between natural explanation and unsettling coincidence grew impossible to ignore. On one hand, orbital models could trace each comet back to its origin, showing how they had been nudged inward by Jupiter or Saturn, or how their long, slow orbits finally carried them near the sun again after thousands of years. On paper, there was nothing inherently impossible about their timing, and yet, when laid out against a timeline, when paired with the interstellar outsider, the neatness of those explanations rang hollow. If you dropped a deck of cards on the floor, sure, technically they could all land in sequence, 1 through 7. But if they did, would you really call it random? Or would you start to wonder if someone had stacked the deck before letting them fall? That was the position astronomers found themselves in, stuck between facts and patterns that felt like something more. And outside their circles, speculation ran wild. Online forums filled with charts, maps, and theories. Some claimed that the comets were fragments of a much larger parent body that had shattered millennia ago, now arriving in a cluster as its offspring spread across the solar system. Others went further, suggesting hidden alignments with Earth's history, pointing to ancient records of comet swarms that had coincided with times of upheaval or dramatic change. And then there were those who ignored all caution and claimed outright that the timing was not coincidence at all, that something intelligent, something beyond our comprehension, had orchestrated the arrival. Of course, mainstream science pushed back against those ideas, as it always does. But even the most rigid skeptics couldn't entirely erase the uneasy feeling, because timing matters. Context mattered, and the context here was as strange as it gets. A solar system already ramping up into solar maximum, with the sun spitting flares and storms, a planet mired in political, social, and technological tension, and suddenly, above it all, a sky filled with visitors that didn't belong, arriving together like actors stepping onto a stage for the second act of a play that no one even knew had begun. The public fascination grew not just because of the comets themselves, but because of the narratives that formed around them. Every culture has its myths, its ways of interpreting the sky, and when the heavens grow crowded, those myths come roaring back to life. To many, the timing of the swarm felt like a warning. To others, it was a promise of revelation, that some great truth was about to be exposed, and no matter which side you fell on, it was impossible to ignore the sense that 2025 was becoming a year unlike any other in living memory. The mystery deepened each night as more people lifted their eyes to the sky, snapping photos, sharing stories, arguing in forums. The timing had made believers out of skeptics, or at least made skeptics pause before dismissing the unease. Because while science can calculate orbits and project trajectories, it cannot yet explain why events sometimes converge with such uncanny precision, and in that gap between explanation and mystery, human imagination thrives. The suspicious timing of the comet swarm, paired with the interstellar arrival of 3I Atlas, became more than a story about icy rocks drifting through space. It became a symbol, a riddle written across the sky, asking questions humanity wasn't ready to answer. And as those questions spread, one thought kept surfacing, whispered late at night in conversations both scientific and superstitious. What if this wasn't just chance? What if the universe was trying to get our attention? When the first comet was announced, most people ignored it, as they usually do. It was faint, still distant, a line in a new wire that hardly anyone outside of astronomy circles would have cared to read. But in hindsight, that comet was like the opening note of a symphony, a signal that the sky was about to put on a performance unlike anything most living people had ever seen. Because that single visitor did not remain alone for long. Soon another arrived, and then another, until it was clear that we weren't dealing with isolated apparitions, but a full cast of cosmic wanderers making their entrance one after another. 7 comets, each with a story, each with an identity, yet all of them bound together by the strangest of coincidences, their timing. It was as though the universe had decided to stage a celestial lineup, presenting them not quietly, but in a way that demanded attention. The first to be noticed was Comet Pan-STARRS, named after the powerful telescope array in Hawaii that has been sweeping the skies for years, catching objects before the naked eye can ever spot them. At first glance, Pan-STARRS was unremarkable, just another icy traveler from the outer solar system, the kind that rarely gets more than a line in a scientific catalogue. But what made it stand out was that it brightened faster than expected, surprising even the astronomers who first logged it. Normally, a comet's light grows slowly as it approaches the warmth of the sun, but this one seemed eager, its icy body shedding material more energetically than the models had predicted. Amateurs who pointed small telescopes toward it were rewarded with a faint but undeniable smear of light, a reminder that the sky had secrets still unfolding. Not long after, Comet Swan followed. This one felt different from the start, brighter, livelier, as though determined not to be overlooked. Swan flared so dramatically that in darker skies it was visible without instruments, a greenish glow with a faint tail stretching outward like a banner. People who had never cared about astronomy found themselves stepping outside, shading their eyes, and trying to spot the visitor. Social media filled with shaky phone photos, most of them blurry, but all carrying the same tone of awe. Something was happening above us, and we could all see it together. Swan didn't last long. It fragmented, disintegrating before it could reach its full potential. But even its brief appearance set the stage. It was as if the comet had burst onto the scene with a message, then burned itself out, leaving behind only question. The third arrival was Comet Stereo, a faint but steady presence that seemed content to play a quieter role in the unfolding spectacle. Unlike Swan, it didn't blaze across the headlines, but its timing made sure it was noticed by those who were paying attention. To astronomers, its arrival so soon after Swan was yet another data point in a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. How often did comets come in pairs, much less in trios within months of each other? To the casual observer it may have seemed ordinary, but to those charting the skies, it was another piece of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly into the old expectation. Then came Atlas. Actually, more than one Atlas, because multiple comets discovered by the Atlas Sky Survey System began to emerge. One in particular, sometimes called Atlas K1, drew attention by brightening significantly as it neared the Sun, its tail stretching longer, its head glowing brighter, as if eager to outshine its predecessors. There was something almost theatrical about its performance, as though it understood that it was part of a chorus, and it wanted its voice to be the loudest. The fact that comets were arriving so close together was already stirring whispers, but when Atlas flared, those whispers turned into murmurs, and the murmurs began to resemble unease. How many more were waiting in the wings? And just as people began to ask that question, Atlas G3 appeared, another from the same sky survey but distinct in its trajectory and timing. The repetition of the name itself was strange, as though the sky wanted to remind us not once but twice that Atlas was part of this story. Each comet had its own orbit, its own origin, but together they painted a picture of something far more organized than random. Like voices singing in unison, they overlapped, reinforcing the message, look up, pay attention, don't dismiss what you're seeing. The lineup continued with Comet Lemon, an oddly named visitor that, despite its less dramatic performance compared to Swan or Atlas, still contributed to the sense of weight gathering in the heavens. Lemon was dimmer, more reserved, but it was another name, another presence, another reminder that this was not an isolated event. Even faint comets, when they arrive in the midst of a swarm, take on a new significance. They become part of the pattern, part of the chorus, and Lemon's quiet glow did just that. Finally came Comet Neat, a name drawn from an older survey but a visitor that nonetheless joined the cast. Neat may not have dazzled the way Swan had or burned brightly like Atlas, but its arrival sealed the impression that the sky was staging something deliberate. 7 comets, each unique, each on its own journey, yet all converging in human awareness at the same moment. The strangeness of this cosmic lineup wasn't lost on anyone. Astronomers could plot their paths, measure their velocities, and explain their origins in cold mathematical terms. But those explanations did little to erase the unease that grew with each new arrival, because comets aren't just numbers on a chart. They are lights in the sky, visible to anyone who cares to look, reminders that the universe is not static, but alive, shifting, sending visitors our way without warning. And when those visitors arrive one after another, in a procession that feels almost coordinated, it's impossible not to wonder what message, if any, is being delivered. To those who like to see the universe as a story, the lineup of 7 comets was almost too perfect. Pan stars, the opening note. Swan, the blazing flare that captured the public's attention before breaking apart. Stereo, the steady presence in the background. Atlas K1, the bright showstopper, followed by Atlas G3, its companion echo. Lemon, the quiet but undeniable participant. And Neat, the final name on the list, the one that seemed to close the curtain on the act. Together they felt like a cast assembled for a performance, each one bringing something different to the stage, each one leaving its mark. For humanity, it was both exhilarating and unnerving. On one level, we were watching one of the rarest sky shows in modern history, a cascade of visitors that few generations will ever experience. On another level, we were left with the same questions that had haunted every culture since the dawn of time. Why now? What does it mean? Is the sky trying to tell us something, or are we simply reading meaning into the chaos of nature? For some, the answer didn't matter. The meaning was in the spectacle itself, in the sense of awe and unease it inspired. For others, the search for answers became an obsession, driving them to pore over orbital data, ancient records, and speculative theories, hoping to find some key that would unlock the pattern. And through it all, the comets continued their journeys, indifferent to the speculation they sparked, following paths written long before humanity ever learned to look up. Yet their timing, their grouping, their sheer presence refused to fade into background noise. They were here, together, and whether by chance or design, they had reminded us of a truth we often try to ignore. The universe is vast, unpredictable, and sometimes it chooses to speak in ways we cannot easily explain. For most of history, people could live their entire lives without ever seeing a comet that truly lit up the sky. Generations passed with only whispers of stories told by grandparents who remembered a glowing tail stretching across the heavens decades before. That was the natural rhythm of things, the way the universe seemed to space out its displays, like a stage manager carefully rationing fireworks so that they never lost their impact. When Halley's Comet blazed across the skies in 1910, it was considered a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle, and indeed many who saw it never lived long enough to witness its return. 76 years later, that was the standard expectation. Comets were rare, fleeting, and extraordinary, and yet here we are, in a single year, not with one, not with two, but with 7 bright visitors, a number so disproportionate that even the most cautious scientists hesitate before calling it normal. Because when you step back and look at the bigger picture, the truth becomes clear. This isn't just unusual, it's something that rewrites the very pattern we thought we understood. To understand how rare this is, you need to consider the mathematics of probability. Naked eye comets, the kind that require no telescope, no special equipment, appear roughly once every 5 to 10 years, sometimes longer. In between, there may be dimmer ones that only astronomers notice, but those don't inspire the same awe or cultural reaction. In an average human lifetime, you might see a handful at most. For 7 to cluster together in the span of one calendar year is not just bending the odds, it's crushing them into dust. Imagine rolling a die and getting the same number 7 times in a row. Sure, technically it's possible, but when you see it happen, you don't call it chance. You start looking for a reason, some hidden hand that loaded the dice before they were cast. And that's where the unease begins, because the universe does have mechanisms that can explain unusual clustering. Massive planets like Jupiter act as gravitational shepherds, nudging comets inward or flinging them outward, shaping their orbits in ways that sometimes deliver them into Earth's neighborhood. But Jupiter has been playing that role for billions of years, and in all that time we've never documented a cluster quite like this. If Jupiter alone could account for the parade, we should have seen it before, not just now, not just in this one peculiar year. Some argue that we simply weren't watching carefully enough in the past, that many comets went unnoticed by early civilizations, but that explanation feels thin. Ancient cultures were obsessive skywatchers, charting movements of stars and planets with remarkable precision, and they recorded comets with awe and fear. If a year like 2025 had unfolded in their time, with visitor after visitor streaking across the sky, their records would be overflowing with frantic notes, and mythologies would be drenched with stories of multiple omens arriving in quick succession. Instead, the few records we have show isolated events, rare and spaced apart, reinforcing what science tells us. The norm is scarcity, not abundance. So if scarcity is the rule, then what explains the sudden abundance? One theory suggests that many of the comets we're seeing now may once have been part of a larger body, a giant frozen wanderer that shattered into fragments long ago. Over centuries or millennia, those fragments drifted apart, but not so far that their paths no longer intersected. Now, as their orbits align by chance, they're arriving in our skies like siblings reunited, spread out enough to be catalogued as separate objects but connected by a common ancestry. It's a plausible scientific explanation, one that allows astronomers to file the event neatly under rare but not impossible. Yet even this theory raises unsettling questions. Why now? Why would these fragments converge at this exact moment in history, timed so neatly with our own growing awareness of the cosmos, and in tandem with an interstellar outsider like 3I Atlas? Science can describe the mechanics, but it cannot silence the feeling that something larger is at play. For many, the eerie part isn't just the number of comets, but the way they overlap in visibility, as though queuing up for an audience. One begins to fade just as another brightens. One disintegrates spectacularly, only for the next to take its place a few weeks later. This choreography, if it can be called that, makes it feel less like randomness and more like a performance, a sequence designed to ensure there is always something to see, always a reason to keep looking up. Humans are good at seeing patterns where none exist. True, but sometimes patterns are real, and the difference between the two can be razor thin. When the night sky delivers spectacle after spectacle with no pause in between, it is natural, even instinctive, to ask whether we're witnessing coincidence or connection. Adding to the strangeness is the global context. The year 2025 is not quiet. It is a year already charged with tension, with humanity grappling with crises on Earth, while the sun itself grows restless, entering the peak of its cycle with flares and storms. Against this backdrop, the comets don't feel like isolated natural events. They feel like punctuation marks in a larger story, as though the universe itself has decided to emphasize the turbulence we're already living through. In ancient times, this would have been interpreted without hesitation. Multiple comets in a single year meant chaos, upheaval, or transformation. Kings would have feared for their thrones, priests would have declared omens, and ordinary people would have braced themselves for disaster. In our modern world, we may not speak in those terms, but the effect lingers. We don't call them omens anymore, but we feel the unease just the same. Even within the scientific community, the sense of discomfort is palpable. Yes, the math works out. Yes, orbits can be traced and explained, but scientists are human too, and when the sky suddenly fills with more comets than anyone alive has ever seen, even the most rational minds struggle with the weight of it. Some acknowledge that there are statistical flukes in every field, moments when probabilities bend and reality delivers something extraordinary. Others remain silent, unwilling to say aloud what they wonder privately, that perhaps our understanding of cometary dynamics is incomplete, that perhaps something unknown is stirring at the edges of the solar system, nudging these icy wanderers inward all at once. If that's the case, then 2025 may not be a one-time anomaly, but a sign of more to come. The public doesn't need detailed orbital mechanics to sense the strangeness. All they need to know is that 7 glowing visitors have appeared in rapid succession, and that alone is enough to ignite imaginations. Stories spread online about alignments, about hidden meanings, about prophecies whispered in ancient texts. Even those who don't believe in such things find themselves pausing when the sky blazes unexpectedly bright, wondering if perhaps the old myths had a grain of truth in them after all. It's easy to dismiss superstition when the sky is quiet. It's harder to laugh at it when the heavens seem to be shouting. And so the question lingers, heavier with each new discovery. Why this year? Why now? Why all at once? If comets are truly just icy leftovers drifting at the whim of gravity, then this parade is nothing more than a freak coincidence. But if there is more to them, if they are messengers, symbols, or even warnings, then ignoring them could be the greatest mistake we ever make. What makes this moment so unnerving is that science, for all its precision, cannot close the door on that possibility. The numbers explain the mechanics, but they don't explain the timing, and it's the timing that haunts us. So here we stand, beneath a sky that is busier than it should be, watching as visitor after visitor streaks across the darkness. To some, it is beauty. To others, it is terror. But to everyone, it is undeniable. This is not normal. This is not the rhythm the universe has followed for countless generations. Something has changed. Something has shifted. And until we understand why, the comets will continue to hang over us like questions without answers, daring us to look up and wonder what it all means. When the 7th comet had been confirmed and the reality of the swarm could no longer be brushed aside, people began to ask the question that hung silently in the background of every observation, every photo, every whispered late-night conversation. Why? Why were they here, and why now? It was one thing to accept a comet or two as part of the natural rhythm of the solar system, icy wanderers casually dropping by before returning to the darkness from which they came. It was another to face the fact that the sky had suddenly grown crowded, that a rare event had multiplied itself into something without precedent in modern memory. In the absence of certainty, theories began to spread like wildfire. Some were grounded in physics, others in ancient superstition, and still others drifted into the edges of imagination, where science dares not tread. And while many of these theories contradicted each other, they all shared a common undercurrent. The first theory, and perhaps the most comforting to those who needed an explanation that stayed within the bounds of reason, was gravitational shepherding. For centuries, astronomers had understood the role of Jupiter, the solar system's giant, in shaping the movements of comets and asteroids. Its massive gravity acts like a cosmic gatekeeper, pulling in some visitors, flinging others out, and occasionally tossing a few into the inner solar system where Earth can see them. It's true that Jupiter has been responsible for some of the brightest cometary displays in history. It's also true that it can sometimes deliver multiple comets within the same period of time, though never in a sequence quite like this. To believers in this theory, the 7 comets of 2025 were simply the result of an unusual but possible alignment, Jupiter's influence gathering and releasing icy bodies, like a fisherman casting a net and pulling in a catch too large for anyone to ignore. This explanation was elegant in its simplicity, and it gave people something solid to hold on to. The swarm wasn't a sign, wasn't a warning, just another outcome of celestial mechanics. But even those who favored the Jupiter theory had to admit that something about it felt incomplete. If Jupiter's shepherding had delivered these comets, why had we not seen such an overwhelming cascade before? The gas giant has been circling the sun for billions of years. Humanity has been watching the skies for thousands. Surely, if this were a normal possibility, there would be historical records filled with similar years, moments when the heavens rained omens one after another. Instead, the records were quiet. A comet here, a comet there, never a chorus. And so while the shepherding explanation fit the math, it did not erase the sense of anomaly. It was a neat theory, but it left the haunting impression that it was only half the story. Another theory, less comforting and far more unsettling, revolved around fragmentation. According to this view, what humanity was witnessing was the delayed result of some ancient cataclysm, a massive comet or icy body that had shattered long ago on the fringes of the solar system, sending fragments scattering in all directions. Over time, those fragments, though spread out, remained loosely bound in their trajectories, and now, by coincidence, a cluster of them happened to be arriving in the inner solar system almost together. This was a plausible scenario, and in fact, scientists had seen echoes of it before. Comet Showmaker Levy 9, torn apart by Jupiter's gravity in the early 1990s, sending a string of fragments crashing into the giant planet in a series of fiery collisions. If a similar breakup had happened to a much larger body ages ago, then 2025 might simply be the year when its offspring all reached perihelion, their closest approach to the sun in quick succession. But here too, comfort was limited. Fragmentation might explain their shared timing, but it also introduced new fears. What if these comets were not harmless showpieces but dangerous remnants of a larger body? Fragments that could one day cross Earth's path with devastating consequences. History is filled with stories of cosmic impacts, from the Tunguska event of 1908 to the asteroid strike that ended the reign of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. To imagine that 7 comets, all related by a catastrophic breakup, were now drifting through our skies was to imagine that Earth had just been brushed by the cosmic equivalent of shrapnel, fragments from a long-forgotten explosion now tumbling toward the heart of the solar system. If 7 could arrive in 1 year, what did that say about the possibility of dozens more waiting in the wings, invisible until they too made their fiery approach? The fragmentation theory might have explained the swarm, but in doing so it also raised the stakes, turning a sky show into the shadow of a potential future catastrophe. Then came the whispers of a third theory, one that scientists dismissed but that refused to die among the public: electromagnetic manipulation. This idea suggested that the comets weren't merely drifting at the whim of gravity, but were being influenced by some hidden force, perhaps electromagnetic fields woven through the solar system, or even deliberate manipulation by intelligences beyond our own. Supporters of this theory pointed to the peculiar behavior of the interstellar visitor Three-Eyed Atlas, which had shown activity far from the sun, glowing and shedding material when it should have been frozen solid. They wondered aloud whether comets might not be as passive as we think, whether some of them might respond to forces we have not yet identified, or worse, whether their arrival had been orchestrated. The word orchestrated carried with it a weight that made many laugh nervously, but it lingered all the same. Could it be that the 7 comets of 2025 were not accidents of physics, but pieces of a message, a demonstration of power, or even a warning? Scientists were quick to remind the public that no evidence supported such claims, and yet, in the absence of certainty, imagination filled the void. People remembered Oumuamua, the first interstellar object ever recorded, with its bizarre cigar shape and unexplained acceleration that some astronomers cautiously admitted could have been the result of forces we didn't understand. Now, with Three-Eye Atlas and the swarm of comets, it wasn't hard for people to connect the dots, however speculative. The thought that something intelligent might be behind the clustering was terrifying. but it was also intoxicating. For those who had always dreamed of proof that we are not alone in the universe, the swarm seemed like a stage performance written for humanity's benefit. The show so grand that it could not possibly be ignored. Even those who dismissed alien theories couldn't escape the dread that came with the unknown. If not manipulation, then perhaps the swarm was a harbinger of something else. A shift in the solar system's balance, a disturbance we had yet to detect. What if a massive object lurking on the fringes, the long-theorized Planet 9, for instance, was tugging at the Oort cloud, shaking loose comets and sending them inward in waves? If so, 2025 might only be the beginning, the first ripple of a storm that could last decades or centuries. To imagine a hidden giant stirring the outer darkness, nudging icy bodies toward the sun, was to imagine a future filled with not just 7 comets, but 70 or 700, a slow-motion bombardment unfolding on timescales humanity could barely comprehend. Of all the theories, perhaps the most terrifying was the simplest, that we didn't know enough to explain what was happening, that our models, our calculations, our centuries of skywatching were still incomplete. The comets might be messengers not because they carried a deliberate signal, but because they reminded us of our ignorance. They were proof that the universe can still surprise us, still disrupt our neat expectations, still remind us how small and fragile we are under the vast dome of the stars. And in some ways, that possibility that we are simply unprepared and outmatched was more frightening than any theory of alien intervention. Because at least if there was intelligence behind the swarm, there might be meaning. If it was just chaos, then we were adrift in a storm we could never hope to control. As theories multiplied, one thing became clear. No explanation fully erased the unease. Whether it was Jupiter's shepherding, ancient fragmentation, hidden giants, or forces we had yet to discover, the fact remained that 7 comets had arrived in a single year, and no one could say with absolute certainty why. Theories gave people comfort, but not closure. And in that space between comfort and closure, the fear grew. Because when the sky speaks in ways we cannot explain, we have no choice but to listen, and to wonder what might be coming next. Among the 7 visitors that defined this strange year, none stood out more than the outsider, the one that didn't belong to our solar system at all. The others could be explained, however, uneasily by orbits that had been stretched and twisted by gravity over millennia, icy remnants from the birth of the planets that happened to find their way inward. But 3I Atlas was different, marked with a designation that told the whole story. The I didn't stand for comet or asteroid, it stood for interstellar. This was no local wanderer, no native child of the sun's family. This was a traveler from the depths between the stars, an alien in every sense except the literal, and its sudden arrival in the same year as the comet swarm made it impossible to ignore. Interstellar objects are not supposed to be part of our story. For all of humanity's history, the universe outside our solar system had remained untouchable, visible in the form of distant starlight, but never sending us physical messengers. The first time one arrived was only a few years ago, when the oddly shaped Oumuamua appeared in 2017, streaking past the sun on a path that could never loop back, its velocity too great to be captured. That strange visitor sparked debates that still rage today. Was it a fragment of an alien planet, a shard of ice and rock flung loose by some ancient collision? Or was it, as a few daring voices suggested, something else entirely? A probe, an artifact, a crafted object sent deliberately across the stars? The truth was never found, and Oumuamua slipped away into the darkness, leaving behind only question. When 3I Atlas appeared, it felt as though the sequel had arrived, but this time in a more dramatic fashion. Unlike Oumuamua, which was dark, elongated, and largely inert, this interstellar traveler behaved more like a comet, brightening, shedding material, and acting alive in ways that demanded attention. What unsettled astronomers most was that it began showing activity long before it should have, far from the warmth of the sun, out where temperatures were so low that even the most volatile ices should remain frozen solid. 3I Atlas started to glow. Jets of material seemed to escape its surface, creating a halo of light that was inexplicable under normal physics. Some suggested it was made of exotic substances, ices more unstable than those usually seen in comets, triggered into sublimation even by the faint light of distant starlight. Others wondered if the object carried a composition unlike anything in our catalogues, a chemistry born not of our sun but of some alien star system, something foreign that we could not yet identify. But the timing was what made it impossible to dismiss. What were the odds that a second interstellar object, only the third ever detected in all of human history, would arrive in the exact same year Earth was already experiencing a record-breaking flood of comets. The overlap was almost too neat, too scripted, as though the universe had chosen this moment deliberately to remind us how little control we have over what comes our way. For the public, the coincidence was irresistible. To many, 3i Atlas wasn't just a comet, it was the protagonist of the story, the stranger who walks into town just as chaos breaks loose, the figure whose presence raises questions no one can answer. And unlike the other comets, which could at least be tied back to known reservoirs like the Oort cloud, 3i Atlas came from nowhere, from the cold emptiness between the stars, carrying with it the mystery of entire systems we had never seen. As telescopes around the world tracked it, the object continued to defy neat categorization. Its orbit was open, hyperbolic, a trajectory that made it clear this was not a permanent member of our solar system. It had come from elsewhere, was passing through, and would soon vanish into the void, never to return. That knowledge gave its appearance a fleeting, almost theatrical quality. This was a once-in-a-species encounter, a visitor we could study for only a short window before it was gone forever. Every night mattered, every measurement mattered, because once it slipped away, it would take its secrets with it. Scientists worked frantically gathering data, while the public spun stories around it faster than they could be disproven. One of the strangest aspects was the way it seemed to behave differently from typical comets. Some astronomers reported fluctuations in brightness that didn't line up with distance or solar heating, almost as if the object was irregularly shaped and rotating in a way that exposed jets of gas unpredictably. This led speculation that it might not be a simple ball of ice at all, but something fractured, hollow, or layered with volatile materials unknown to us. Conspiracy theorists seized on these details, claiming the fluctuations were deliberate, signals sent in a cosmic Morse code. Scientists rolled their eyes at such talk, but the truth was that no one could fully explain the data, and the human mind abhors a vacuum. Where certainty fails, imagination thrives, and 3i Atlas gave imagination a banquet. Perhaps what disturbed people most was not just the object itself, but the symbolism of it. For the first time, humanity was seeing multiple visitors from beyond our star system in such a short span of time, after centuries in which none had ever been noticed. What did that mean? Was it simply that our telescopes had finally grown sensitive enough to detect them, and that they had always been passing by unseen? Or was there a deeper reason, something about this moment in cosmic history that had opened the door to outsiders? If interstellar objects like 3i Atlas and Oumuamua had always been drifting silently through, what did it say about our place in the galaxy that we were only just now beginning to catch them? And what if, some whispered, they were not simply drifting at all? Theories began to multiply, each one more unsettling than the last. Some suggested that interstellar comets might be fragments of distant planetary systems destroyed by cataclysms we could not yet imagine, carrying with them the ashes of alien worlds. If that were true, then 3i Atlas was not just a comet, it was a tombstone, a relic of something lost, a reminder that even planets can be wiped away. Others proposed more hopeful interpretations, seeing it as a messenger, a fragment of another sun's nursery, proof that the galaxy was alive with countless other systems not so different from our own. And then inevitably came the darker ideas, that such objects were not natural at all, but artifacts, probes, or even weapons sent deliberately into the galaxy to scatter, to drift, to one day be noticed by civilizations like ours. The idea was terrifying, but it clung stubbornly to the narrative, because it was easier in some ways to imagine intention than to accept chaos. Even within professional circles, the presence of 3i Atlas alongside the comet swarm was acknowledged as more than coincidence. It might be random, they admitted, but it was a kind of randomness that rattled the nerves, a reminder that the universe does not always spread its mysteries evenly across time. Sometimes they cluster, they cascade, they overwhelm, and when they do, humanity can only watch and wonder. The fact that this interstellar stranger was among them added a layer of alienness to the year's story, a whisper that said, "You are not alone, not in this system, not in this galaxy, not in this universe." And so 3i Atlas became more than just a comet. It became a symbol of everything unsettling about the swarm, the embodiment of the feeling that this was not normal, not routine, not just a fluke of orbits and gravity. It was the outsider, the wild card, the figure that turned a strange year into something unforgettable. It lit up the night skies briefly, it dazzled telescopes, it unsettled the experts, and then, as quickly as it had arrived, it continued its endless journey, leaving Earth to argue about what its visit had meant. But in the end, perhaps the meaning was not in its origin, or its chemistry, or even its odd behavior. Perhaps the meaning was in its timing, that it had chosen to arrive, or had been forced to arrive, in the exact same year as the greatest cometary parade in living memory, was a coincidence so bold that it refused to fade. For the rest of the story, every other comet was measured against it, every theory was haunted by it, and every person who looked up at the sky that year carried the same thought. The stranger had come, and it had come at a time when the heavens were already speaking louder than ever before. Every comet carries within it a moment of truth, a test written into its orbit, long before humanity ever knew it existed. That test is perihelion, the point where its long, lonely journey through the freezing dark ends in a brief, fiery encounter with the sun. For millions of years, some of these objects drift in silence, invisible and unremarkable, nothing more than frozen rubble drifting in the black. But perihelion is where their secrets are forced into the open. It is here, when the ice begins to vaporize and the nucleus begins to shed its ancient skin, that a comet becomes visible to Earth, transforming from a nameless speck into a dazzling spectacle. And it is here, too, that they often meet their end, breaking apart under stresses too great to endure. It is the trial that no comet can avoid, and in 2025, as the swarm of 7 reached their own perihelia one by one, humanity found itself waiting for each verdict, as though watching the climax of a cosmic play. Perihelion is not just a point on a chart. It is an event of violence and revelation. The sun's heat is merciless, and comets, though majestic in the sky, are fragile things. Most are little more than loose collections of ice and dust, their nuclei only a few kilometers wide, held together not by strength, but by ancient stillness. When that stillness is shattered by the heat of the sun, what emerges is unpredictable. Some flare brilliantly, their tails growing so long they stretch across half the sky, showering Earth's atmosphere with dazzling meteor storms. Others crumble into dust, their promise extinguished in a sudden, anticlimactic fade. Watching a comet approach perihelion is like waiting for a secret to be revealed. You never know whether it will arrive as a revelation or as silence. In 2025, the drama of perihelion played out again and again. Swan had been one of the most dramatic, flaring unexpectedly bright in the days before its closest approach, leading observers to believe it would become the comet of the decade, only to fracture and collapse into nothing, leaving only a faint smear of dust in its wake. That collapse shocked the public, because it had happened just as people were beginning to look up, just as excitement was at its peak. It was as if the comet had chosen to perform its most dramatic act, not in brightness but in death, reminding everyone how fragile these celestial wanderers truly were. Atlas K12 broke apart, its nucleus splitting under stresses it could not withstand, scattering fragments that briefly glowed before fading into the void. For each comet that disintegrated, there was a sense of loss, as though a story had been cut short just when it was becoming interesting. Yet even in their destruction, they commanded attention, because each breakup hinted at mysteries about their inner structures and their long histories drifting through space. Other comets survived perihelion with more resilience, flaring brighter than expected, their tails stretching longer each night as they curved away from the sun and into darker skies where Earth could admire them. Pan-stars held steady, offering a sustained glow that gave observers weeks of beauty. Lemon, though faint, surprised with a brief brightening, a subtle reminder that even the quieter members of the swarm had their moments of revelation. Neat, the final arrival, lingered just long enough to feel like a closing chapter, carrying its light across the horizon before fading back into obscurity. Together, their perihelia played like crescendos in a symphony, some loud and dramatic, others quiet but haunting, each one reminding us that comets are not static bodies but dynamic, volatile, and alive in ways that defy predictability. But the one that drew the most attention was of course the interstellar stranger. For 3i Atlas, perihelion was not just a test of survival, but an unveiling. Everyone wanted to know, would this alien traveler flare into brilliance, proving itself unlike any comet we had ever seen before, or would it quietly disintegrate, leaving us with nothing but theories and lost opportunities? As it drew closer to the sun, its activity grew strange. Jets of material burst forth in unexpected directions. Its brightness fluctuated wildly, and its path appeared to wobble in ways that unsettled even seasoned astronomers. To some, these fluctuations were evidence of irregular rotation, or perhaps volatile materials venting explosively from its surface. To others, they were signs of something more, patterns too deliberate to dismiss, almost as if the object were trying to communicate in bursts of light. No one could agree, but no one could look away either. The tension surrounding perihelion wasn't only about spectacle. There was a deeper unease, a fear that these fragile bodies, pushed to their limits, might fragment in ways that altered their paths. A disintegrating comet can scatter debris across vast swaths of the solar system, debris that can one day intersect Earth's orbit. Every breakup carried with it the reminder that what is beautiful in the sky can also be dangerous. Astronomers ran simulations calculating where the fragments might go, whether any posed even a small risk of collision. The results were mostly reassuring, but the fear lingered. What if one splintered piece found its way onto a trajectory that intersected our planet in years to come? Each perihelion became not just a display but a roll of the dice, a test of fate. For the public, however, perihelion was a moment of pure theatre. Around the world, people gathered to watch, some with telescopes, some with nothing but their eyes and the hope of a clear night. Social media flooded with blurry photos, dramatic headlines, and breathless updates. Every new burst of brightness became a trending topic, every unexpected fade a cause for disappointment. The comets weren't just objects anymore. They had become characters in a story, each with its own arc, each with a climax that people followed with the same anticipation they reserved for human drama. In coffee shops, classrooms, and online forums, the question was the same: would the next comet survive its trial, or would it crumble under the sun's unforgiving gaze? And beneath that excitement lay something darker, something that grew each time another comet fractured. If these bodies could fall apart so easily, then perhaps they were not as harmless as they appeared. Perhaps their fragility was not comforting, but dangerous, a sign that they were unstable, unpredictable, and capable of sending fragments into orbits that no one could foresee. The fact that they were arriving together only amplified the fear. If one comet can pose a risk, what about 7? What about their debris clouds overlapping, intertwining, creating hazards invisible until it was too late? Perihelion didn't just reveal the beauty of the comets, it revealed their fragility. And with fragility comes danger. For scientists, the swarm was a once-in-a-lifetime laboratory. For humanity, it was a reminder that the universe does not owe us comfort. Watching comet after comet endure, fail at perihelion, was like watching the universe peel back its mask, showing us truths we were not sure we wanted to know. Each revelation was both awe-inspiring and unsettling, a blend of beauty and terror that no one could fully explain. And through it all, the question remained: was this truly just coincidence? Or was perihelion itself part of a larger drama, a curtain rising on a story we hadn't yet begun to understand? Because if there is one thing perihelion teaches, it is that nothing survives unchanged. Every comet is transformed by its trial, whether it emerges brighter or disintegrates into nothing. And perhaps in watching them, we were being reminded of something about ourselves, that humanity too is moving toward a moment of truth, a trial we cannot yet see, but one that is already written in the orbits of history. The comets were not just icy wanderers, they were mirrors, reflecting our own fragility, our own uncertainty, and our own hunger for meaning in a universe that offers so little. And as the swarm of 2025 reached their perihelia one by one, humanity was left not with answers but with the uneasy certainty that the sky had more to say, and that its most important revelations were still to come. While the comets blazed across the sky one by one, another force was quietly building its own spectacle, one far more dangerous and unpredictable than the icy visitors themselves. That force was our own star, the sun, entering the peak of its natural cycle, the solar maximum of every 11 years or so. The sun's magnetic fields twist and churn in a kind of cosmic heartbeat, growing restless until they erupt in bursts of violence. Sunspots multiply, solar flares explode, and massive coronal mass ejections hurl streams of charged particles into space, sometimes directly toward Earth. Most years, this activity is little more than a curiosity for scientists and space weather forecasters, but during solar maximum, the intensity skyrockets, and in 2025, the timing of that peak collided directly with the swarm of comets, creating a convergence of cosmic drama that no one could ignore. The sun has always been humanity's lifeline, and our greatest threat. It warms the Earth, drives our climate, feeds the plants that sustain us, but it also has the power to disrupt everything we've built. When a solar flare launches a wave of charged particles into space, those particles slam into Earth's magnetic field, sparking auroras at the poles, but also surging through the systems we depend on. Satellites can be fried in moments, power grids can collapse under the sudden spikes, communication systems can go dark, and airplanes can be forced to reroute to avoid radiation risks. These events have happened before, sometimes with devastating consequences. In 1859, the Carrington event, the most powerful geomagnetic storm on record, lit up the skies with auroras as far south as the Caribbean and sent telegraph systems sparking into flames. In 1989, another storm collapsed the entire power grid of Quebec in Canada, plunging millions into darkness in less than 2 minutes. And now, as 2025 unfolds, scientists have warned that we are due for another storm of that magnitude or worse, precisely because the sun is reaching the chaotic peak of its cycle. That warning took on an eerie resonance against the backdrop of the comet swarm. For centuries, people have looked at comets as omens, signs of disaster, harbingers of great change. In more modern times, science has stripped much of the superstition away, replacing it with calculations and orbits. But when the comets appeared in the sky at the exact same time the sun was waking up in fury, it was hard not to feel that the old stories had come alive again. If comets symbolized chaos, then the sun was chaos made real, not symbolic at all, but tangible, measurable, and dangerous. The combination of the two, the omens in the sky and the star unleashing its storms, created a sense that 2025 was not just another year, but a turning point, a moment when the heavens and the earth were caught in a dance that might reshape everything we thought we knew. Astronomers tried to explain the connections rationally. The comets were not directly caused by solar activity, and the sun's storms were not triggered by their presence, but the overlap was impossible to ignore. Comets interact with the solar wind, their tails shaped and sometimes torn apart by the constant stream of particles flowing outward from the sun. During solar maximum, that wind grows more turbulent, more violent, and comets can flare unpredictably as they're struck by waves of energy. Their tails can twist, fragment or glow brighter under the influence of magnetic storms. Observers watched as some of the 2025 comets displayed sudden changes in brightness and structure, leading many to speculate that the sun itself was shaping their performance. Even if they were not directly linked, the perception of connection grew stronger with every solar flare that coincided with a new burst of cometary light. It was as though the sky itself had decided to stage a coordinated show, comets blazing while the sun roared, two cosmic actors feeding off each other's drama. For humanity, the danger wasn't only in the symbolism. The practical risks of solar maximum were real and immediate. Satellites that control GPS navigation, weather forecasting, military operations, and global communications were suddenly at higher risk of failure. Engineers scrambled to prepare shielding and backup systems, but the truth was that no technology on Earth is entirely immune to the fury of the sun. In late 2024, a solar flare had already knocked out shortwave radio communications across parts of the Pacific, a warning shot that hinted at what was to come. In early 2025, another eruption forced airlines to ground transpolar flights for fear of exposing passengers to dangerous radiation. Each event, though minor in the grand scheme, served as a reminder that solar storms don't need to be apocalyptic to disrupt modern life. And as the year advanced and the comet swarm grew, people began to connect the dots. It wasn't just that the sky looked strange. It was that the strange sky seemed to coincide with real-world tremors in the systems that keep our world running. The unease deepened as geomagnetic storms triggered by the sun began to paint the skies with auroras visible far beyond their usual boundaries. Cities in Europe and the northern United States, places unaccustomed to such displays, saw brilliant curtains of green and red shimmering across the night. At first, people celebrated, rushing outside to take photos, marveling at the unexpected beauty. But beauty has always had a double edge. To many, the auroras looked less like gifts and more like warnings, lights that arrived hand in hand with reports of satellites glitching and power grids groaning under strain. Ancient civilizations had once looked at comets and auroras as signs of divine wrath. Now, in 2025, with our advanced science and technology, people found themselves slipping back into the same unease. The heavens did not feel calm. They felt volatile, unpredictable, and charged with meaning we couldn't quite put into words. As more comets approached their perihelia, their interactions with the solar storms grew harder to dismiss as coincidence. Some flared brighter just as solar flares erupted, as though ignited by invisible sparks. Others fragmented in ways that seemed suspiciously timed with bursts of solar wind. Astronomers insisted that it was just physics, that comets are fragile and solar activity was bound to influence them. But the narrative forming among the public was far less restrained. People began to see the sun as a conductor, orchestrating the swarm, pulling the strings of these icy wanderers to create a performance that no one on Earth could ignore. Whether or not the science supported that view didn't matter. What mattered was that the perception spread, and with it a growing conviction that the universe itself was sending a message through the convergence of comets and storms. Governments quietly prepared for the worst, running simulations of power outages, communication blackouts, and even global supply chain disruptions that could result from a Carrington-level event. The public wasn't told the full extent of the risks, but leaks and rumors circulated, feeding into the sense that something larger was at stake. Combined with the comet swarm overhead, the idea that Earth was standing at the edge of a cosmic storm began to feel unavoidable. Whether or not the two phenomena were linked didn't matter. Together they created a sense of inevitability, as though the sky was closing in on us, its actors converging on the same stage for a finale no one could predict. What made this convergence so unsettling was not just the beauty of it or the danger of it, but the timing. If comets symbolize change and upheaval, and if the sun's storms can disrupt the very fabric of modern civilization, then having both arrive together felt less like coincidence and more like choreography. For the ancients, this would have been undeniable proof of divine will. For the modern world, it was proof of something else entirely, that we are still small, still fragile, still at the mercy of forces far beyond our control. No matter how advanced our technology becomes, no matter how much we map or predict, the universe still has the power to surprise us, to overwhelm us, to remind us that we are passengers on a ship we do not steer. And as the year went on, that realization grew heavier. The comets continued to blaze and fade, the sun continued to erupt, and humanity continued to search for meaning in the chaos. Was it all coincidence? A rare but natural overlap of cycles? Or was it, as many whispered, a signal, a warning, a cosmic reminder that the universe has patterns we have yet to understand? In the interplay between comets and solar storms, between omens and science, between beauty and fear, humanity found itself staring not just at the sky but at its own vulnerability, and deep down, even the most skeptical could not help but feel that the sun itself had joined the chorus, adding its voice to the strange and unsettling message of. By the time the seventh comet had carved its streak across the sky and the sun's restless storms had spilled over into Earth's atmosphere, the sense of cosmic unease had stopped being an abstract idea and started becoming a lived experience. It was no longer just about what people saw above them. It was about what they began to feel around them. Systems that had once seemed untouchable, the invisible infrastructure that underpinned modern life, began to show cracks under the strain of the sun's tantrums, and every disruption, no matter how small, felt magnified by the backdrop of the comets, as though the heavens and the earth were weaving themselves into the same unraveling story. The first signs came quietly, GPS glitches that lasted seconds instead of milliseconds. Flights delayed not by storms or mechanical issues but because solar activity made polar routes unsafe. Amateur radio operators reported blackouts that swept across frequencies like invisible waves. Most people never noticed, but those who were paying attention saw a pattern forming, and with each headline about unusual solar activity or unexpected satellite outage, the connection to the comet swarm grew stronger in the public imagination. Even scientists who insisted the two events were unrelated had to admit that the timing made the narrative irresistible. Then came the geomagnetic storm that struck in late spring, a storm not catastrophic by historical standards, but unsettling in its reach. Power grids in parts of northern Europe wavered, transformers humming as they absorbed the surge of charged particles. Internet connectivity in certain regions slowed to a crawl, satellite constellations struggling to maintain stability. Airlines cancelled transpolar flights for nearly a week, forcing costly reroutes and delays. For most people, these disruptions were minor annoyances. A flight delayed, a connection dropped, a warning banner across a news site, but in the collective imagination, they became omens, proof that the strange sky was beginning to reach down, and touched the Earth directly. The auroras that followed the storm only deepened the unease. They painted the skies in colors usually reserved for distant latitudes, reds, purples, and greens, spilling across places that had never seen them before. Cities like Berlin, Chicago, and Tokyo watched in awe as the heavens glowed above them, people rushing out of office buildings and apartments to capture photos and videos. The beauty was undeniable, but so was the underlying fear, because alongside the shimmering curtains of light came news stories about satellites experiencing anomalies, communications dropping, and astronauts aboard the International Space Station taking shelter in shielded areas to avoid spikes of radiation. The auroras, once symbols of wonder, began to feel like glowing warnings written across the sky. They were breathtaking, but they were not free. They were the visible face of storms that had the power to unravel the very systems humanity depended on. As summer arrived, the cascade of disruptions began to feel relentless. A navigation system used by shipping companies in the Pacific experienced intermittent failures, forcing vessels to revert to older backup methods. Cell towers in parts of North America temporarily lost synchronization, dropping calls and causing panic among those who saw their devices suddenly fail. An entire network of low-orbit satellites, part of the global rush to blanket Earth in high-speed internet, suffered malfunctions that took weeks to fully diagnose. Engineers reassured the public that the issues were manageable, that redundancies existed, but to those watching the skies already filled with comets, these disruptions felt like confirmation that something larger was at play. It wasn't only technology that seemed unsettled. Strange weather patterns began to overlap with the celestial drama, creating a sense that the Earth itself was responding. A series of unseasonal storms struck regions unaccustomed to them, flooding cities and uprooting the idea of normal climate in places that had long relied on predictable seasons. Heat waves followed, breaking records in Europe and Asia, accompanied by droughts that crippled agriculture. Of course, scientists explain these events as part of the ongoing climate crisis, a result of human industry and decades of environmental neglect. But for ordinary people already primed to see signs in the heavens, the overlap was too much to dismiss. 7 comets above, a raging sun, and now the Earth beneath their feet buckling under extremes. It all felt like pieces of the same unsettling puzzle. In communities around the world, superstition began to mingle with science in ways that hadn't been seen for generations. Religious leaders gave sermons about the signs in the sky, interpreting the comet swarm and solar storms as evidence of prophecy fulfilled. Online forums buzzed with speculation about end times, alien contact, and government cover-ups. Social media exploded with theories, each one more dramatic than the last, spreading faster than the corrections scientists tried to issue. To many, the combination of celestial omens and earthly disruptions was no longer a matter of coincidence. It was a narrative, a story that was being written in real time, with humanity caught in the center. Governments tried to maintain calm, issuing reports and guidelines about space weather preparedness. But leaks revealed that behind closed doors, the conversations were more urgent. Military strategists worried about vulnerabilities in communication systems. Economists ran models of what might happen if a Carrington-level event were to strike during this already volatile year. Agencies tasked with monitoring space weather quietly upgraded their warning systems, while power companies began rushing to stockpile replacement transformers in case of catastrophic surges. The public heard whispers of these preparations, and even though officials insisted they were precautionary, the effect was the opposite of reassurance. If the people in charge were worried enough to prepare for worst-case scenarios, then surely the worst case was not so unthinkable after all. What made the situation even more unnerving was the unpredictability of it all. Comets could be tracked, their orbits calculated with precision, but their behavior near the sun was still a mystery. Solar storms could be monitored, their eruptions detected, but the impact they would have on Earth's systems often remained uncertain until the moment they struck. This unpredictability created a constant tension, a sense of waiting for the next shoe to drop. Every news alert about a solar flare, every new photograph of a comet's tail stretching across the sky, became part of the same drumbeat of anxiety. It wasn't just that strange things were happening, it was that no one could say what would happen next, and in that silence fear grew louder. The human reaction to these converging phenomena became as much a part of the story as the phenomena themselves. Stock markets experienced sudden swings as rumors spread about potential grid failures. Companies selling solar storm protection equipment saw surges in demand. Conspiracy theorists gained massive followings, their videos racking up millions of views as they tied together comets, solar cycles, and geopolitical turmoil into one ominous narrative. And quietly, in countless private moments, ordinary people looked up at the sky with a mix of awe and dread, wondering if the universe was trying to tell them something, or if they were simply reading meaning into chaos. By autumn, the pattern was undeniable. Technology was faltering in small but persistent ways. Weather was erratic, the sun was restless, and the comets continued to pass overhead like silent witnesses. Whether or not they were connected, the perception of connection had taken root, and in human affairs, perception can be as powerful as fact. The result was a world living under the weight of a story it could not control, a story where the skies and the earth were no longer separate but intertwined, where omens and science blurred into the same unsettling truth, that 2025 was a year when the universe itself seemed determined to remind us of our fragility. If the comets were the messengers and the sun was the roaring backdrop, then the truest impact of 2025 wasn't in the skies at all. It was in the minds of the people who watched them. For thousands of years, humanity has looked upward and seen more than stars. We've seen reflections of ourselves, of our fears, our hopes, our myths, our gods. Every civilization has mapped its stories onto the heavens, carving constellations out of scattered points of light and weaving meaning into streaks of fire across the night. In a way, the comets of 2025 did nothing new. They did not alter the laws of physics or rewrite cosmic history, but what they did was ignite something ancient in us, a spark of primal recognition that we live under a sky that is not silent, a sky that can still intrude on our lives, a sky that demands interpretation. And it was in that demand for meaning that the real drama unfolded, not just on the celestial stage, but within the human imagination. The psychological toll was subtle at first, woven into the fabric of daily life. People who would never normally look up at the stars began following comet trackers and solar weather forecasts, the way others follow sports scores. News outlets learned quickly that stories about the swarm drew more clicks than politics or celebrity scandals. People wanted updates, wanted to know when and where to look, wanted reassurance that what they were seeing was normal even as they secretly hoped it wasn't. There was an intoxicating duality to it. Fear and fascination bound together, each fueling the other. Even those who claimed to be skeptical found themselves glancing at the horizon at night, half hoping to see a tail of fire stretching above them. The comets had become not just objects but characters, and humanity had cast itself as both audience and participant in their story. But fascination is never neutral. For some, the comets became sources of inspiration, a reminder of the vastness of the universe and humanity's small but miraculous place within it. Artists painted streaks of fire over cityscapes. Poets wrote verses about cosmic omens. Musicians wove the imagery of the swarm into their lyrics. Across cultures, the comets were absorbed into symbols of change, of endings, of rebirth. In some circles, they became metaphors for personal transformation. Their fiery journeys through the solar system mirrored in the struggles and renewals of individuals trying to make sense of a chaotic world. Self-help gurus and spiritual leaders alike seized on the imagery, urging people to embrace their comet moment, to shed the old and flare into something new before fading into the unknown. For these communities, the comets were not harbingers of doom, but reminders of resilience and beauty. Yet for others, the story turned darker. Fear of the unknown is a powerful force, and in 2025 it found fertile ground. Online communities began to spin apocalyptic narratives, framing the swarm as the beginning of the end, proof that the Earth was entering a period of divine reckoning or cosmic judgment. Some religious sects declared that the comets fulfilled ancient prophecies, pointing to verses that had lain dormant for centuries, until suddenly, conveniently, they seemed to apply. Cult-like movements sprouted almost overnight, their leaders preaching that the swarm was a sign to prepare, to purify, to abandon the corrupted systems of modern life and return to older, stricter ways. A few groups went further, claiming the comets were not natural at all but harbingers of alien intervention, sent to herald the arrival of beings who would soon reveal themselves. These ideas spread quickly in a digital world hungry for certainty, and even though most dismissed them as fringe, the fact that they existed at all spoke to the raw anxiety simmering beneath the surface of society. The cultural impact was not confined to belief systems. It seeped into daily interactions, shaping the way people spoke, the way they planned, the way they dreamed. A young couple in Madrid postponed their wedding, saying they didn't want to celebrate under bad omens. In New York, A tech company postponed a product launch after their analysts noted that public sentiment was too unsettled, that the headlines were distracting people from anything that wasn't celestial. In Tokyo, bookstores reported a surge in sales of astrology guides and apocalyptic fiction, while in Cairo, families gathered on rooftops to watch the skies together, reviving communal traditions that hadn't been practiced in decades. Even those who didn't believe in omens found themselves behaving as though the comets mattered, as though their presence had shifted the cultural atmosphere in ways no one could deny. Psychologists began to notice something too, a collective rise in what they called cosmic anxiety. Patients spoke of feeling small, vulnerable, exposed under a sky that suddenly seemed more alive than usual. Some described a sense of wonder tinged with dread, others an irrational fear that the comets were targeting Earth specifically. The combination of scientific reports about solar storms, images of auroras bleeding across the skies, and the constant chatter of social media created a feedback loop of unease. People who had never thought about space before were suddenly dreaming of comets crashing into cities, of skies turning red, of technology collapse. Therapists compared it to the psychological impact of living under constant news of war or disaster. Even if the actual risk was low, the perception of risk rewired the mind, leaving people more restless, more irritable, more prone to spirals of catastrophic thinking. Governments, too, began to grapple with the cultural fallout. Intelligence agencies tracked the spread of comet-related conspiracy theories, worried they could destabilize already fragile political climates. Social unrest, they feared, could be sparked not only by economic or social issues but by fear of the sky itself. And in some cases that fear translated into action. In small towns across South America and Eastern Europe, groups held vigils at night, lighting candles and chanting prayers beneath the comets. In parts of the United States, survivalist communities grew bolder, stocking supplies and warning that the comet swarm was the first stage of collapse. Even in highly developed cities, rumors of hidden impacts or unreported collisions circulated widely enough to cause panic buying in supermarkets. The sky, once a shared backdrop, had become a catalyst for division, amplifying old fears and creating new ones. And yet, amid the fear and anxiety, there was also connection. For many, 2025 was the first time in their lives that they felt part of a truly global moment. Everyone, everywhere, was looking at the same sky. In villages and skyscrapers, deserts and islands, people craned their necks to watch the same streaks of light, to marvel at the same auroras, to wonder about the same questions. Conversations crossed borders and languages, united by the shared awe of a sky alive with fire. In a fractured world, the comets created a rare moment of collective attention, a reminder that despite all our differences, humanity still shares one fragile planet under one vast dome of stars. And perhaps that was their most profound impact. Not the fear they stirred, not the disruptions they symbolized, but the way they forced us to remember that we are one species, small and vulnerable, but also capable of wonder. By the end of the year, it was clear that the comets and the solar storms had left their mark, not just on astronomy, but on culture itself. They had reignited ancient patterns of thought, blending superstition and science, fear and hope, dread and inspiration. They had changed the way people saw the sky, the way they saw themselves, and the way they imagined the future. Whether one viewed them as omens, as natural phenomena, or as mere coincidences, there was no denying that they had woven themselves into the human story, into the collective psyche of a species always searching for meaning in the vast, mysterious universe. And the most haunting part was that no one could say whether their message had already been delivered, or whether the true revelation was still waiting to unfold. While the public wrestled with awe and dread, searching for meaning in the blazing sky, the scientific community found itself in its own quiet storm. Scientists are trained to deal in evidence, in data, in carefully measured probabilities. But 2025 was not a year that lent itself easily to calm equations and confident predictions. For every explanation that seemed solid, there was a new anomaly, a new twist that pulled the ground out from under their feet. The swarm of comets, the solar maximum, the sudden arrival of an interstellar visitor, it all collided in ways that left even the most disciplined minds unsettled. And while most of the world imagined scientists as calm voices of reason, what unfolded behind observatory doors and in private conferences was far more complicated. At first, the response was cautious optimism. Comets are opportunities after all, time capsules from the early solar system. pristine samples of material unchanged for billions of years. To have not one but 7 comets pass through in the same year was a dream for planetary scientists who rushed to schedule telescope time, design observation campaigns, and lobby for missions that might capture unprecedented data. In early press conferences, astronomers smiled as they described the swarm as a unique laboratory, stressing how much humanity could learn from such a rare alignment. The message was clear: this was not an omen, not a threat, but a gift of discovery. But as the month wore on, cracks began to show. The comets refused to behave like neat laboratory subjects. Some brightened dramatically before disintegrating into dust. Others dimmed unexpectedly, or fractured in ways no model had predicted. Their tails shifted and bent under the solar wind in ways that hinted at complexities the textbooks had glossed over. And then there was 3I Atlas, the interstellar wanderer that simply refused to fit into any tidy box. Its early outgassing, its strange fluctuations in brightness, its unpredictable trajectory, all of it defied easy categorization. The more data poured in, the more the story began to resemble the public mood, fascination laced with unease. The debates grew heated in academic circles. One camp insisted the swarm was a statistical fluke, rare but not impossible, a product of chance amplified by the gravitational influence of Jupiter and the chaotic nature of the Oort cloud. Another camp pushed back, pointing out that no historical records suggested a precedent for such a concentrated appearance. If this had happened before, ancient astronomers would have noted it, and their texts would be filled with descriptions of skies crowded by multiple comets. The absence of such accounts, they argued, made the swarm more than coincidence. Perhaps a larger body had fragmented millennia ago, sending pieces inward on similar orbits. Perhaps a hidden perturber in the outer solar system had stirred the Oort cloud. Or perhaps, most unsettling of all, something about our models was incomplete, and the universe was showing us gaps we had yet to fill. The interstellar visitor fueled the fiercest disputes. Was 3I Atlas simply a comet from another star system, one of many that passed by unnoticed, its discovery a product of improved telescopes rather than cosmic timing? Or was its coincidence with the swarm significant, a clue that something larger was happening on galactic scales? Some scientists warned against anthropomorphizing chance, reminding colleagues that humans are hardwired to see patterns, even where none exist. Others countered that science itself is built on recognizing patterns, and dismissing one this bold risked overlooking a discovery of enormous consequence. For every researcher who urged caution, another urged curiosity, and the friction between those instincts grew sharper as the year wore on. International collaborations, usually celebrated for their unity, began to reveal tension as well. NASA, the European Space Agency, and observatories across Asia and South America raced to secure telescope time and funding, sometimes clashing over priorities. Should resources focus on the brightest comets, which promised the most dramatic data, or on the faintest, which might hold subtler secrets? Should 3I Atlas take precedence, given its interstellar origin, or should the focus remain on the homegrown swarm that threatened to rewrite our understanding of cometary dynamics? Behind the scenes, arguments flared in committee rooms and private emails, where egos, reputations, and national pride collided as fiercely as the celestial bodies they studied. And yet, for all their disagreements, the scientists shared something with the public, the creeping sense that this year was different. It wasn't just the number of comets. It wasn't just the solar maximum. It was the way it all came together, layered one atop the other, until even the most rational minds felt the pressure of narrative. Some whispered about the return of Thomas Kuhn's paradigm shift, the idea that science progresses not just through steady accumulation of knowledge, but through disruptive upheavals that force entire fields to rethink their foundations. Was the universe revealing a blind spot in our understanding, something as transformative as the discovery that Earth revolved around the Sun, or that space itself was expanding? No one wanted to say so outright, but in late-night conversations at conferences, in hushed exchanges at telescopes, the thought lingered. At the same time, scientists faced a challenge that was as much social as intellectual: how to communicate uncertainty in a world that demanded certainty. Every time an astronomer appeared on television or gave a public lecture, they were asked the same questions. Why now? What does it mean? Is Earth in danger? And the truth that the answers were complex, incomplete, and sometimes unknowable did not satisfy. Some tried to reassure, emphasizing probabilities and historical context. Others leaned into the mystery, framing the swarm as a reminder of how much humanity still had to learn. Both approaches drew criticism. Reassurers were accused of minimizing the strangeness. Mystery embracers were accused of fueling panic. The line between education and narrative became almost impossible to walk, and many scientists found themselves withdrawing from public discourse entirely, retreating to their data in frustration. Meanwhile, a few voices within the community began to break ranks, speaking more openly about unconventional ideas. Could electromagnetic forces play a role in comet behavior beyond what we'd accounted for? Could the swarm be evidence of a larger cycle in the solar system we had yet to detect? Could interstellar visitors like 3I Atlas be more common than we thought, perhaps even connected to phenomena we had dismissed too quickly? These questions were often ridiculed by peers, but they also drew attention, their boldness capturing the public imagination in ways dry equations never could. The result was a divide, the mainstream insisting on caution, the fringe pushing into speculation, and the public caught between unsure whom to believe. The strain showed most clearly in the younger generation of scientists, many of whom had entered the field inspired by the mysteries of the cosmos, and now found themselves living through one of the most bewildering years in modern astronomy. Some felt exhilarated, as though they had stumbled into history. Others felt overwhelmed, struggling with the pressure to produce answers in an environment where answers were elusive. For every graduate student thrilled to be analyzing comet tails or modeling solar interactions, there was another lying awake at night, wondering if the universe they thought they understood was slipping through their fingers. The comet swarm wasn't just reshaping the sky, it was reshaping careers, ambitions, even identities. And through it all, the data kept coming, relentless and enigmatic. Spectral analyses revealed unusual chemical compositions in some comets, hints of complex organics that raised questions about the role of comets in seeding life. Fragments of broken comets traced unpredictable paths, challenging orbital models. 3I Atlas continued to defy expectations, its behavior refusing to conform to any standard playbook. Every new discovery seemed to answer one question only by raising three more. Scientists who had entered the year hoping for clarity found themselves instead buried under a mountain of mysteries. By the end of 2025, the scientific community was no closer to consensus than it had been at the start. The swarm had been studied, documented, debated, and dissected, but the fundamental questions remained unresolved. Why now? Why so many? Why with such strange behavior? And what did it mean for humanity's future? Some clung to the belief that time would sort it out, that with patience and persistence the anomalies would yield to natural explanations. Others whispered that this was the beginning of something larger, a slow unraveling of assumptions that would force a revolution in how we saw the cosmos. But whether they leaned toward reassurance or revelation, one truth was undeniable. 2025 had reminded even the experts that science is not a fortress of certainty, but a journey through mystery. And in that sense, the scientists were no different from the rest of us, staring upward, searching for answers and realizing that the sky still holds secrets powerful enough to humble us all. By the time the final comet of the swarm trailed across the horizon, the story was no longer just about the heavens. It had become entangled with the machinery of Earth itself, governments, economies, and the fragile bonds that held nations together. The comets were above us, yes, but their influence was everywhere, seeping into boardrooms and parliaments, into stock exchanges and election campaigns, into conversations that had nothing to do with astronomy, but could not escape the shadow of the sky. What had begun as an astronomical curiosity had swollen into something larger, something political, something global. The first domain to feel the pressure was economics. The modern world runs on confidence, on the belief that tomorrow will behave like yesterday, that systems will remain stable enough for investments to pay off and goods to keep moving. But in 2025, confidence began to wobble. The solar storms that disrupted satellites and communications rattled the financial markets, which depend on precision timing and data flows that cannot afford even brief interruptions. Trading algorithms faltered when GPS signals jittered. Communication blackouts, though temporary, sparked rumors of cyber attacks and left investors nervous. Insurance companies, faced with growing evidence that solar storms posed real risks to satellites and grids, began rewriting policies, raising premiums, and warning of liability. All of it combined to create a sense of fragility, as though the invisible networks holding the global economy together were suddenly exposed to forces no human institution could control. Stock markets reflected the unease. They swung erratically with each new report of a flare, a geomagnetic storm, or another comet fragment breaking apart. Aerospace companies saw their values rise briefly, driven by interest in satellite hardening and new space weather defense contracts. But the gains were overshadowed by losses in airlines, telecommunications, and shipping. Agricultural markets were hit too, not directly by the comets, but by the extreme weather that seemed to coincide with the year's chaos: heat waves, droughts, and storms that disrupted crops in multiple regions. Grain futures spiked, sparking fears of shortages. Oil prices, already volatile from geopolitics, became even more erratic as shipping delays mounted under disrupted navigation. It wasn't that the comets themselves had broken the economy. It was that their presence, coupled with the solar storms, had eroded trust. People looked up and saw instability written across the heavens, and that instability seeped downward into every ledger and forecast. Governments faced the political fallout almost immediately. Leaders tried to project calm, framing the comet swarm as a rare but harmless spectacle, a chance to celebrate the beauty of the universe. But reassurance was harder to sell when power grids flickered, when flights were grounded, when rumors of hidden risks went viral faster than official statements. In democratic nations, opposition parties seized on the unease, accusing incumbents of downplaying the risks or failing to prepare. In more authoritarian states, leaders leaned on the comets as tools of propaganda, declaring them symbols of destiny, proof that their rule had cosmic validation. In both cases, the result was the same. The sky became political currency, a resource to be used, twisted, and exploited. International relations grew more complicated as well. Space agencies tried to coordinate their responses, but cooperation quickly tangled with competition. Who would get the best telescope time, the best data, the first access to fragments from a disintegrated comet? Which nations would share their solar weather forecasts honestly, and which would hold back information for strategic advantage? As always, science was not immune to politics. Rumors swirled that certain militaries were exploring whether solar storms could be harnessed or weaponized, that covert research was underway to predict or influence space weather for national gain. None of it could be proven, but in an atmosphere already thick with suspicion, the rumors were almost as destabilizing as fact. And beneath the geopolitical maneuvering, ordinary people wrestled with their own consequences. Anxiety, already heightened by the cultural and psychological impacts of the year, began to manifest in tangible shifts in behavior. Some communities turned inward, hoarding supplies, preparing for the possibility of blackouts or communication failures. Others turned outward, seeking collective reassurance in vigils, rallies, and sky-watching gatherings that blended science with ritual. In both cases, the comets had shifted the rhythm of life. Nights were no longer just nights. They were events, opportunities to look up, to talk, to speculate. Even in cities where light pollution had long erased the stars, people found themselves standing on rooftops, straining to see faint tails streaking against the glow. The sky, ignored for so long in the glare of modern life, had reclaimed its power. The media too played its role, amplifying both wonder and fear. Documentaries rushed into production, blending scientific explanation with dramatic visuals and ominous narration. News outlets ran endless features on the comets, some sober, others sensational, their headlines swinging between gift from the universe and signs of doom. Social media platforms became battlegrounds where amateur astronomers, conspiracy theorists, spiritual leaders, and pranksters all competed to frame the narrative. Every new cometary outburst, every solar flare, every aurora painted across an unexpected sky became fodder for millions of posts, memes, and debates. In the cacophony of voices, certainty was drowned out, and what remained was a global conversation dominated by awe, suspicion, and the creeping sense that something larger was unfolding. In places where faith played a central role in daily life, the comets became woven into sermons and rituals. In some churches, priests preached that the swarm was a divine warning, urging repentance. In others, the comets were framed as reminders of God's majesty, tokens of creation's beauty. Mosques, temples, and shrines echoed similar themes, their leaders interpreting the celestial drama through the lenses of their traditions. For many, these interpretations offered comfort, a way to place the incomprehensible within a framework of meaning. But for others, the religious fervor only deepened the unease. stoking fears of apocalypse or divine judgment. The comets became symbols of division as well as unity, capable of binding people together in awe, or driving them apart in fear. What made the consequences of 2025 so profound was not that the comets or the sun destroyed anything directly. Cities did not fall, economies did not collapse, governments did not vanish overnight. What changed was subtler but in some ways more enduring: the erosion of the illusion of stability. For decades, humanity had lived with the quiet assumption that the sky was background, that the forces of the cosmos were distant, irrelevant to daily life. The comet swarm shattered that illusion. It reminded us that the Earth is not insulated, not separate, but part of a larger system that can intrude at any time. The solar storms made the intrusion real, tangible, undeniable, and once that realization spread, it could not be undone. By the close of the year, whispers of a new era were everywhere. Politicians framed it in terms of resilience, promising to invest in hardened infrastructure and space weather monitoring. Activists framed it as a call to humility, urging humanity to reconsider its arrogance in the face of a vast and unpredictable universe. Economists debated whether the comet year marked the beginning of a permanent new volatility in markets. Philosophers and writers spoke of the comets as metaphors for fragility, for impermanence, for the suddenness with which the familiar can become strange. Each interpretation revealed as much about human fears and desires as it did about the actual comets. But all shared a common thread. No one doubted that the year of the swarm had changed something fundamental. And so, as the last comet faded into the distance, as the sun's storms gradually began to ease, humanity found itself standing in the aftermath not of a disaster, but of a revelation. The world was still intact. The cities still stood. The systems still hummed. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The old certainty that the heavens were silent had been broken, and in its place stood a new awareness, raw and unsettling, that we live in a universe still capable of reminding us of our place, still capable of intruding into our lives, still capable of rewriting the story at any moment. And once reminded, humanity could not forget. In the end, the year of the comet swarm was not defined by destruction but by revelation, not by the fall of cities but by the fall of certainty. No comet struck the Earth, no solar storm plunged the world into permanent darkness, no prophecy unfolded in the way zealots had promised. Yet something undeniably changed, something far more enduring than fire and ruin. The sky reminded humanity that it is not passive wallpaper, not a stage set that can be ignored. It is alive, dynamic, capable of awe and terror in equal measure. And when it speaks as it did in 2025, we are forced to listen whether we wish to or not. The 7 comets blazed and fractured, each carrying within it secrets from the birth of the solar system, each writing its own arc of brilliance and fragility before fading into the void. The interstellar stranger, Three-Eye Atlas, came and went, never fully explained, never fully understood, a messenger from elsewhere that left more questions than answers. The sun roared and shimmered, casting auroras over cities unaccustomed to them, disrupting satellites and stirring unease, a reminder that even our star, the source of our life, is also a source of instability. Together, these forces converged into something greater than the sum of their parts, a year that felt less like coincidence and more like a cosmic performance staged for an audience of 8 billion. For scientists, it was a humbling reminder of the limits of knowledge. For leaders, it was a lesson in the fragility of the systems they claim to control. For ordinary people, it was a confrontation with wonder and fear, a chance to look upward and feel both small and significant at once. Some saw omens, others saw opportunities, but all were bound together by the shared experience of living under a sky that refused to be ignored. And perhaps that was the quiet gift hidden within the chaos, a fleeting moment of unity, a collective gaze turned upward, a reminder that beyond borders, beyond conflicts, beyond divisions, we are one species beneath one sky. Yet the conclusion is not a neat one, because the story the comets told was never meant to be finished. They arrived, they astonished, and they left, but the unease they stirred will linger long after their tails have vanished from the horizon. We are left with questions. Why did they come together in such numbers? Why now, in the same year, the sun raged at its peak? Was it truly chance, or part of a pattern too vast for us to yet see? And if it was a pattern, what comes next? The answers may take decades, centuries, or perhaps they will never be fully known. But the lesson of 2025 is that the unknown is not empty. It is alive, it is powerful, and it is always closer than we think. So perhaps the true conclusion is not closure at all, but a state of awareness, a shift in how we see ourselves in the cosmos. We are fragile, yes, but we are also witnesses. We are vulnerable, yes, but we are also storytellers. The comets came and went, the sun burned and raged, and humanity did what it has always done. It watched, it wondered, it tried to make meaning. And maybe that, more than anything else, is the point. The universe speaks in fire and light, in ice and storm, in omens and enigmas, and we respond in stories. The comet swarm may never repeat in our lifetimes, but the questions it raised will echo for generations, a reminder etched into memory that the sky is not silent, and that our story is still being written in its vast and mysterious expanse.